Welcome back to a virtual class. Today's lecture is going to be focusing on a couple of major areas of tension. One that resulted in an actual war in Korea, and another that led the world to the closest it would ever be to nuclear war during the Cold War. Excuse me. So that's why we're going to take a look at these, what I'm labeling Cold War tensions, or a focus on a couple of major events during the early Cold War era that um, not only had major implications and consequences for the United States, but for the entire world. But before that, I want to quickly just kind of talk about some things I've updated on the calendar. You can still come to Canvas and check on the schedule here. I'm kind of, making some changes with how things have sort of changed since we initially parted ways, before spring break, which feels like forever ago. Um, but anyway, as you can see, we are here at April 2nd, the Cold War hot spots, which is up there at the top, or the tension areas. Um, and then next week, remember, we're going to have our first WebEx discussion, and a reminder that I will send all of you an invite for the particular days that you are grouped to have your discussion. So be on the lookout for that. And we'll be reading the chapter, the May chapter, the Containment at Home, which hopefully you'll see has a lot of content that relates to the lecture I gave on building or manufacturing the American dream. Um, and then we're going to talk about the Vietnam War next week, and then we'll start discussing the civil rights era, the more well-known civil rights era, and then the reading on the Last Man to Die, which will have a lot to kind of do with um, the Vietnam War era. That'll be the following week. We'll have that discussion. And then we'll talk about America during the 1970s. And you can see the modern American culture when I've moved back. And I'll give you more instructions on what we're going to do with that. But don't lose sight as well with the research paper. Um, the first draft will be due that April 13th. And if you have any worries, concerns, questions on any of this stuff, please let me know. Don't I know we're not seeing each other a lot, obviously, but I don't want that to inhibit or you know detach you so much to the point where you don't feel like you can reach out and get help. And I'm happy if any of you want assistance through even like setting up a WebEx conference call for like office hours. I know some professors are doing that. I'm happy. I haven't established or set any sort of like office hours just because I know all of your schedules are at this point probably really altered than what they would normally be if we were still on campus. But if you want to do that, send me an email and say, hey, do you mind? Can we set up a time to get on WebEx and talk over this at this day and time or whatever? Please don't hesitate. That's what I'm here for. So, as always, any questions, concerns, I want you to email me. Um, all right. So coming back now to our lecture for today. Um, so as I said, we're gonna first talk about the Korean War, which a lot of times, since it's in between the Second World War and the Vietnam War, which, at least in American culture, those two wars receive a lot more um, coverage, attention, emphasis the Korean War is often overlooked in sort of the larger analysis of the Cold War era at times. In general, obviously, historians, don't forget it, but sometimes in our kind of collective memory, I know it can kind of sort of be forgotten. And then we'll talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis and then what that meant. And so we talked about that one lecture. I talked about sort of atomic diplomacy and how atomic weapons changed ways in which countries uh, sort of negotiated, and how the Cuban Missile Crisis will alter that once again. And as always, remember to look through your slides beforehand. I apologize, I forgot to send them in that email from the last lecture, but I'll remember hopefully every time to just make sure you run through those, because as you probably have picked up, I'm rambling quite a bit when we get to some of these pages with a lot of that content. And if you're trying to see what that content really says as I'm discussing this stuff, it's not going to make a lot of sense. You really want to know what's on that slide before I really go into it, or just maybe a matter of pausing clearly the video, reading it, and then letting me sort of fill in. But anyway, all right, the Korean War. So, like anything, we can't just jump in. I've got to do a little bit of backfilling so we know why this war started and what was the cause. And so we have to go all the way back, really to 1905, because the Korean Peninsula, which is located sort of south of Russia, kind of to the east of China, it was annexed by Japan, because remember, Japan and Russia fought a war over disputed territories in 1905. Japan emerged victorious in that war, and as a result, expanded some of its sphere of influence. If you remember me saying that when we talked about the Second World War, and how Japan went through a process of industrialization and modernization in the late 1800s, because Japan at the time sort of was trying to emerge as a major imperial power in the world, at the same time that all these European nations were also trying to establish themselves as imperial powers as well. So Japan was trying to do that in parts of Asia. So it's trying to emerge as just as powerful as Europe, and that means, in defeating a European power like Russia at the time, but also expanding territory at the same time. Of course, like any instance where we see um, an an occupied region that is occupied by a foreign power, there's going to be resistance to that occupation. Yes, of course, some will embrace it and play the side of whoever is in power, but there's always resistance movements to an unwanted occupation. And so that was the case in Korea. Kim Il Sung, who, if you're somewhat familiar with the current leader of North Korea, this is the Kim Il family. The lineage dates back to this time, and Kim Il Sung was a communist, because by the early 1900s, communist movements had sort of spread into regions of in Asia as well. And so, and I'll talk a little bit about that in relation to China too. But so Kim Il Sung was a communist, and he was one of the leaders of resistance to Japanese occupation. And so, so during the Second World War, right, we already talked about how the United States and Soviet Union put aside their differences to defeat a common enemy. And so the United States and Soviet Union both identified resistance movements against their common enemies in these regions and sided with them. So, for example, at this time during the so China had actually been engulfed in a civil war that was Sun Yat-sen was leading Chinese nationalists against uh, Mao Zedong and the communists in China. So there was a civil war going on between these two sides before the Second World War. Then the Second World War started, and those two sides that were warring actually sided with each other while they were while they were trying to resist Japanese occupation in China as well. So the same thing's going on in Korea. So there is no North and South Korea at this time. It's just the Korean Peninsula that has this internal struggle going on for uh, for like a unified power. Um, but with Japanese occupation, clearly it leads to uh, the divisions that were there ending for a while to defeat the common enemy. Once Japan was defeated after the war, because the Soviet Union and the United States were both fighting within these areas, they agreed that for temporarily, they were going to divide Korea along the 38th parallel, which you'll see on a map in just a moment. So basically, it's dividing the peninsula in half. And so this was, again, they had both defeated the Japanese forces on the Korean Peninsula, and the Soviet Union sent in uh, military aids to help sort of begin to rebuild the northern part of the Korean Peninsula, and the United States did the same for the southern part of Korea. So there's no North Korea, South Korea yet. It's just regions that were being occupied by the United States was in the south, and then the region occupied in the north by the Soviet Union. Well, uh, after the war, the United Nations, remember, so the United Nations formed after the Second World War. So it's the governing body. It replaced the League of Nations that was weak and defunct. And the United States this time joined the United Nations. Pretty much every country in the world had become a member of the United Nations. It extended for free and open elections in Korea. However, Kim Il Sung uh, blocked the process of elections in the northern part where the Soviet Union had been occupied um, after the war. And the United States supported the anti communist leader who was in the South. So clearly, you can already see that the United States wants a pro democracy government to form, where the Soviet Union in the north and Kim Il Sung and his forces want to install a communist regime. So there's disagreement. So instead of having anything resolved, these two areas remain basically divided. Um, and so by this point as well, so by 1948, because this was supposed to be now a United Nations led reconstruction, both the United States and Soviet Union had removed their troops. But what happened then in June of 1950, Kim Il Sung uh, communicated with Stalin in Russia, the Soviet Union, and he told him he was ready to invade South Korea to try to reunify the entire peninsula as one communist regime. And Stalin basically said, sure, why not? We don't have to have any Soviet troops sent in. And Stalin also knew that if anything did come up, China, which the Civil War had ended in China in 1949, and the communists um, had emerged victorious in that war. So he knew that the communist forces in China, the communist China, would be able to come to the northern Korean forces aid should that happen. So anyway, Kim Il Sung and the northern forces invade the South. The United States, going through the United Nations, received support from other nations around the world to intervene and try to um, repel the northern advance. And this again is this is a proxy war again. Remember that Stalin is going to support anything that is going to help advance Soviet influence, and the United States will do the same for um, trying to create um, governments that are more in line with the United States and oppose the spread of communism. So this is like a battleground of American and Soviet ideologies playing out in a completely different country that neither of the two of them really have much interest in, with the exception of wanting their form of politics to be established. And so um, the United States enters into the war, and it lasts for 3 years. And this basically is a pretty good summation of what happened. As you can see, this is the Korean War in 4 maps, and it lays it down pretty easily. So the North invades the South. So there's the 38th parallel. You can see right here. This is where they decided to divide the peninsula after the Second World War. So the North invaded the South, and pretty much within months' time, as you can see in that second map, had almost completely defeated the South Korean forces. But with the help of UN and United States forces, they're able to pretty much within a month's time push the northern forces all the way back. So they get them across the 38th parallel very quickly. And then the question became, for the United States, the question became like, well, what do we do now? Do we end the war because we got them back across the dividing line? And they decided, well, why don't we just completely remove the communist forces in Korea, like defeat them completely and create like one Korea as, and install a democratic regime. Well, remember, Stalin supported these efforts mainly because he knew that China would come to the aid of North Korea, and that's what happened. Chinese forces then, right when North Korea was about to be defeated, China came in and helped them, and were able then to push the South Korean and the UN and US forces back almost, back to cross the 38th parallel, and that's where the war ended up in a stalemate. And for the next 3 years, basically, or 2 years roughly, the two sides just, it was a war of attrition essentially, that they then agreed to end in July of 1953, where the war, after millions of lives are lost, the war pretty much ended right where it had began. And this is where we have this is why there's a North and South Korea today. This is, it's a product of this war and a disagreement over how to restructure the entire Korean peninsula that before the Second World War was not divided into a North and South. But because of the Cold War, um, um, you know, tensions and disagreements between the two major powers at the time that had vested interests in how this would shape out, um, got involved in this war. The United States directly got involved, Soviet Union indirectly, um, but then resulted in this, essentially stalemate that created that kept a North and South Korea that is still around today. So, so here's another thing that's happening. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but what is really important to note: after the Second World War, this global imperialism or colonialism, um, where European nations had maintained control, um, and had occupied other countries and regions around the globe, places in Africa, places in Asia. Um, that After the Second World War, a lot of these regions could no longer justify that practice, so they removed a lot of their troops. They still wanted to maintain an economic advantage over them, which they very much were able to do, which sort of has um, uh, you know created what uh, historians will label kind of a neoliberal relationship, where there's no direct um, occupation of the regions, but because of this imbalance that was created over time through the extraction of resources in these areas that um, were able to benefit the imperial power, created this economic imbalance that remained and was not really rectified after the war. But either way, colonialism pretty much ends after the Second World War. But remember, the United States and Soviet Union, who were competing now to influence these regions. So now you have all of these countries that were once essentially occupied states, now independent. The United States and Soviet Union have basically taken on this intense competition to have some sort of influence over what that country's political structure will look like. And so that's why Korea became so important to both of them initially after the war, because the Soviet Union sees the advancement of communism anywhere is a win for them, where the United States interprets that as a loss. Whereas the same thing, the United States feels that anywhere it can keep communism from spreading. So remember Keenan in his that one lecture I talked about, um, he wrote about how they need to contain this communism, and so um, that's what's going on in this kind of global conflict. And this idea of, you see there in that second point, brinkmanship. This is the United States and Soviet Union both know that if they can use intelligence agencies, so something like the CIA in the United States, or other forms of persuasion or pressure in particular regions of the world, to the point that the other country has to react in some way. This is sort of like a foreign policy of brinkmanship, which means you use a different country as basically um, a a puppet in this global conflict to get something that you want from the other country. So the United States wants something from the Soviet Union, so it's going to use a country somewhere in Asia or somewhere in Europe or somewhere in Africa that the Soviet Union also has interest in, and manipulate the policies and politics of that country to either get the Soviet Union to concede something or to possibly push them to the brink of war, right? So that's the idea of brinkmanship. You're pushing the opposing side to the brink of something that you want or that will help you in some way. Um, and so then throughout the 1950s, especially under Eisenhower, there's this intense process of creating all of these alliances that you see there, that were part of trying to keep the Soviet Union from spreading its influence. All right, so that's the Korean War. Now the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is going to be, you know, so the Korean War is 1950 to 1953. Cuban Missile Crisis, we're going to jump ahead about 10 years to 1962. But again, we've got to fill in just a little bit of a background. So Cuba, which is, I guess I'll just jump ahead, um, kind of show you Cuba. So here's Florida up here, Cuba down here. So we have, um, uh, it is not that far off of the coast of Florida. About 90 miles from the coast of Florida is Cuba. And if you remember all the way back to the Spanish-American War, remember how it was a Cuba was an ally of the United States, and they had actually grown. Uh, they had actually created a really strong relationship uh, in this opposition to Spain, and then Spain is defeated. Cuba is eventually given its independence, but throughout um, throughout the 1900s, then things began to deteriorate between the United States and Soviet Union because the United States sort of, if you remember, under Theodore Roosevelt, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, basically saying that the United States has power to intervene in Cuba and kind of do what they want. The U.S. projected itself as the power in the Western Hemisphere. It could, its job, it was very a paternalistic relationship. It was the country that knew best and was going to intervene in countries throughout the Caribbeans and Latin America if it felt that something that was not in the interest of the United States was going to take place. And so the United States had U.S. businesses were um, uh, setting up control of places, agriculture throughout Latin America, like sugar crop, bananas, all of these things that were very lucrative for business in the United States. And some of the local uh, leaders and uh, political activists in these regions were not too welcoming to this type of U.S. influence and control economically. And that led to resistance against the regimes that were in power that were favorable to the United States. And one of those was in Cuba, where there was a revolution in Cuba to try to overthrow the government that um, people like Fidel Castro, who led this revolution, felt had created a huge imbalance in the relationship, that Cuba was being taken advantage of by the United States. So overthrowing the regime was going to be a benefit to Cuba and Cubans. So they succeeded in this revolution and installed a communist regime with Castro in power. And he immediately then reached out to the dominant communist power in the world, the Soviet Union, and formed an alliance. And that's also, another huge sort of, um, uh, Castro saying or basically indicating to the United States, like, all right, we're not messing around. You better respect us. Um, and then the United States attempted to overthrow Castro. Um, CIA. Um, it's the Bay of Pigs, you might have heard of or been taught that before. It was a failed coup on Castro, and that obviously angered him even more. And so he wanted more of an assurance of protection and resistance. And so that led to now Nikita Khrushchev, who you saw in that video. He was the leader of the Soviet Union at this time, Nikita Khrushchev, and Castro agreed to install missiles, nuclear missiles, on the island of Cuba. Now, these are, you can kind of see here, the U.S. spy planes. So you see right here, these are uh, the missiles themselves that are going to be placed into the ground silos that are used to launch them. So the John F. Kennedy is president at the time, so they catch word of this, and it's like, holy, there are going to be nuclear missiles 90 miles off the coast of the United States. And remember, at this point, it's about response time. A missile launched from the Soviet Union to the United States is going to take a lot longer to get there than a missile launched from Cuba. So the United States believes and realizes that the Soviet Union has a huge upper hand um, in the event there's going to be a nuclear war. And so what Kennedy did is he sends out a naval blockade, and that's what you can kind of see on this map here. Set up a zone, and he notified the Soviet Union that we're going to have ships, any ships sailing from the Soviet Union towards Cuba, we are going to stop and inspect. And again, this is going to create now the possibility of head-to-head altercation between the United States and Soviet Union, something that could set off a nuclear war, and it nearly does during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there is a moment where a U.S. and Soviet vessel are kind of uh, playing a game of cat and mouse, and eventually the Soviet ship does uh, uh, acquiesce to the demands of the U.S. vessel, and the confrontation is avoided. But um, for a moment, there was this belief that the United States and Soviet Union were ready to go to war, and not only just regular war, but were ready to launch nuclear missiles at each other over this. And so it created this moment for the world in which it was on the brink of a nuclear war. And so what did that mean? And once calmer heads prevailed, Kennedy and Khrushchev reached an agreement. The Soviet Union would re, was going. The Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in Cuba, and the United States had missiles in Turkey that they agreed that they were going to remove as well. Now, this crisis revealed that brinkmanship was probably not the best approach to diplomacy in the Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union using these areas around the world as sort of pressure points to push on and twist to the point that there had to be intervention. Well, in this instance, there was head-to-head U.S. Soviet intervention that nearly resulted in a nuclear war. And that's what neither side wanted, and of course the rest of the world did not want. Because thinking about this, like thinking somewhat how selfish this is, that these two superpowers who have this capability of annihilating each other off the face of the map of the globe, um, ready to do that, and then the fallout, the nuclear fallout, and the world that would be left behind, the rest of the world would suffer. And to like have these political ideologies to the point where it's like that's what they were willing to go to. It really is just mind-boggling to think about now that's possibly what could have been the result. So what was the aftermath then? What was the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis? And this is our last slide. I see I'm already at 33 minutes here. Um, so what followed the Cuban Missile Crisis is what historians of the Cold War labeled the period of détente. That's what that word is there that you see. Détente basically um, was an era in which both sides um, started to seek more agreements than find ways to disagree. So it's a cooling of tensions, basically, between the two sides after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's like we nearly started a nuclear war. Let's step back from the edge. Because the atomic diplomacy that initially was a product right after the Second World War was mutual deterrence, right? The belief was, and that's why some of the scientists working on the that's why some of the scientists who helped develop nuclear weapons actually supported it, because they believed, look, this weapon's so powerful, you'd be so stupid to go to war, right? Because they knew that this will annihilate an entire population. Like how dumb would you have to be to want to actually use these weapons? Well, you know, uh, humans with massive egos and who aren't going to be thinking clear-headed, but are emotional, possibly could, and they almost did. And so the idea that these weapons could be used as deterrents shifted to the mutually assured destruction, which you might have heard of before, this mutually assured destruction, or MAD, where both sides are assured to completely destroy each other. So it's like this mutual, like that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly brought about. That both sides were willing to, right? They're mutually willing to bring about the complete annihilation of the other side for that sake, right? If you're going to wipe us off the map, we might as well be able to do the same to you. Mutually assured destruction. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two sides began to limit nuclear weapon technology. And so you see a couple of major treaties that came out of this crisis. There's a limited test ban treaty that um, made it a crime, war crime, or a crime against humanity to test nuclear weapons above ground. And then the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty restricted the number of nuclear weapons. And actually, a few nations did not sign the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. North Korea is one of those nations that never signed this treaty. Um, but that was supposed to limit nuclear weapon technology as well, because again, remember the whole idea is the if you're just looking at probabilities, the fewer countries that have nuclear weapons, the less of a probability there will be that a nuclear war will occur. The more nuclear weapons in the hands of more nations could lead to the probability of a greater probability of a nuclear war. So that will wrap up for today's lecture. I already see that I'm past 36 minutes. I apologize. I kind of wanted to get some of those things about the class in general out of the way beforehand. But this is the Cold War tensions, and we'll sort of continue on this with our next lecture when we talk about Vietnam. And I'm looking forward to our discussion, our first discussions next week. So again, any questions, please email me and let me know. All right, see ya.